Welcome to the Informed Pregnancy and Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Elliot Berlin. Today, we're talking about a birth journey with various twists and turns. My guest has a background in gymnastics, dance, and cross-country, and joined the Army after graduating from high school. She's now a health coach and advocate and mother of two, joining us today to share her two very different experiences with childbirth. Gigi Gibbs, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Berlin. I'm grateful to be here.
And congratulations. It wasn't that long ago that you gave birth to your second, most recent.
No, just 4 weeks ago.
Wow. So the story is still fresh.
Very much.
Let's start at the beginning. Where are you from?
Originally from Dayton, Ohio.
How was growing up in Ohio?
It was pretty uneventful compared to living in Los Angeles. I can say that for sure.
Quieter?
Quieter, definitely more trees, more green. Far less diversity than here in Los Angeles, and cold, very cold. I knew when I was like 4 years old, I wanted to leave the cold of Ohio and move to California.
That's one of the things you can't beat around here. But I do miss the trees.
Yes.
I miss not having to go to a park to really hang out with trees.
Yesterday was the first day to give a bottle, and I got to go off by myself, and I was wondering, what am I going to do? Normally I would go on a hike or something, but so I just went and sat in the car.
Oh, wow.
and I drove to a park, and as soon as I got there, my husband sent me a message, okay, come back.
We need you. Well, at least you had a little quiet time.
Yes.
You grew up pretty athletic.
Yes. Most of my siblings, I've got quite a few siblings, and I'm the youngest of them all, and everybody had some sort of role in sports, and so that was always a big part of my life.
What kind of sports did you get into?
I got into gymnastics when I was in third grade, and
oh, wow.
What came with that was just dance, because that's a natural part of that. And then I got into cheerleading in high school and cross country and track and field when I was in middle school and in high school. So sports and athletics has always been a part of my life.
For you, did that athletic lifestyle also come with like an overall healthy lifestyle, eating healthier and other elements of health?
I totally think so. Just even from early times in middle school, coaches talking to us about how to eat before a competition. That was like my first introduction to carb loading. But really it got real in nutrition when I went into the service. That was when I got serious about it and really understood the impact of food and what it looks like.
Did some of your siblings also join the Army?
It's funny, I do have siblings that were from the military, but I'm not a typical military family. Typically when you say military family, you think of someone who moves around every 3 years, but fortunately I didn't have that as my life. But I did have one brother who went to West Point, a sister before me who went into the Air Force, a sister after me who went into the Army. I grew up around an Air Force base. My mom worked in contracting for the government with the Air Force. So it was a part of my life. I was in Air Force ROTC. But
how was the experience for you?
Oh, not one I would want to repeat, but that's a whole nother topic. But it accomplished my two primary goals, which were to get out of Ohio and to get money for college.
What did you study in college?
When I was for undergrad, I did business and nutrition and kinesiology as a minor. And then for grad school, I did public health.
Okay. And now you're a health coach and an advocate for health. What does that mean practically?
Practically, I'm a work-life balance coach, and I really work with high-performing women, and I help them adjust their relationship with work and life demands and help them be able to show up their very best in all their different roles, whether it's mother, employer, boss, business owner, etc.
I mean, work-life balance seems more important than ever, and just like the dream that's so hard to achieve. So that must be both challenging and rewarding when you're able to do it.
Indeed. And I love taking on this notion that you can't have it, or that if you're a working mom, then you're compromised somehow, or if you're a stay-at-home mom, then you're compromised another way. To me, that's BS. And I like disproving that every day.
We should talk. In terms of having kids, did you always see yourself having kids?
No, Not at all.
Oh, really? Because you came from a big family.
I came from a big family and I didn't see myself getting married. I called it the M word for many years. It wasn't until I was about 30 that I was even open up to the idea of getting married. I just wasn't one of those people that grew up with this idea of, oh, I want to have kids and this is what my wedding is going to look like. That just was not me. I just saw myself living a different life.
Do you know what the aversion was?
I think part of it was growing up with so many siblings and then also being a child of divorce. To
Mm.
me, I just saw, okay, this is how that's going to go. So I don't want any part of that.
Well, eventually something must have changed your mind.
Actually, what it was when I went to college and I saw positive examples of marriage in my friends' parents' lives.
Oh,
That
wow.
was that was really eye-opening to me to see, okay, this can go a different way.
Where did you meet your husband?
I was working in sports and sports broadcasting, and I needed it's a funny story. An editor like totally flaked on me, and I called my mentor because I had a deadline, and I said, "Oh, I need to get this done, and there's no one here to cut this tape for me." And he said, "Come to the studio, I'll help you out." And sure enough, the person who was working the overnight was my soon to be husband. Well, much later to be husband, I should say.
That's the first time you met?
It wasn't the first time we met. The first time we met, I was getting a tour of the studio and I was an intern, and he was the one person that the person giving the tour stopped and introduced me to, because my husband's a runner and I was a runner and the guy giving the tour was a runner, and said, "Oh yeah, you guys should talk and both of you should come join my running team." And so that
Oh,
was that was the first time I met him.
the
And
cardio connection.
yes, yeah. And then that night he was working the overnight, and so he totally saved me and helped me get this video cut. And at the time, this was way back when like Palm had cell phones, and he had the
Hmm.
newest Palm. It was the Palm Pre, and I was like, oh cool, and I was playing with his phone, and he totally pulled this line on me and was like, well, since you like my phone so much, why don't you put your phone number in there?
Oh.
And I was like, oh damn, he's got me.
And now look where you are.
Right.
Nobody has a palm. How soon after that did you guys get married?
Oh gosh, almost 4 years. It was a year and a half before I even went on a date with him.
Oh, wow. So it built up over time.
Yes, he asked me out, and I told him, let's keep our friendship at work.
And did you sometime in there start to reconsider having kids?
Well, by then I had decided I was open to marriage, and even after when we were getting married, I was talking to him about having children because I knew on one hand I had what's called PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
and I knew women who had that can have struggles with fertility. And obviously, since I'd never tried to have children before, I didn't know what I would encounter. And so this was after we were married, and I was talking with him about that. And he said, it's either when we were engaged or after we were married. I don't remember. But I'll never forget what he said in response. And he just stopped and looked at me and just said, I'm not marrying you for your fertility. And it was just a moot point with him. He's like, whether we have kids or not, that's not why I'm marrying you.
Oh, that's really sweet.
So kids, even after we got married, was still a 50-50 thing for me. And I was leaning on the side of, this is something I don't want to regret not having done.
Hmm.
And I don't want to look back and say, oh, I wish I would have done it. And I gradually opened up to it. But one thing that was really pressing on me was, one thing I knew about my husband was I knew this man was made to be a father.
Oh, he
It,
sounds
it was
great.
it was really weird because
I
when
want
we
to
were
meet him.
dating, oh well, if I could get him to, although do you see non-pregnant people?
Sure, I do. Yeah, I'd be
Okay.
happy to take care of him.
Yeah, we would, when we were dating or just anytime, kids are just drawn to this man. We'd be at a restaurant and kids would just pop up over the other side of the, what do you call that?
Oh, the little booth?
Yes, the booth. Yeah, I haven't been in a restaurant in so long.
Nobody has.
And they would just, can I play with you? Or we'd be standing in line somewhere and kids would just gravitate to him. And he was just a natural. I'd watch him at his nieces. They'd have birthday parties with like Barbie dolls and tons of toys everywhere. And all the other adult men would be off watching other things and sports or something. Even his niece's own father, she wouldn't even be in there, but he would be there with her, like watching her open every single present. And so I was like, wow, this man was just made to be a father.
Oh, that's so nice.
I knew that about him before I knew I wanted to marry him.
Mm-hmm. Look, on that note, let's take a little break. When we come back, we'll talk about your first pregnancy and birth experience. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Informed Pregnancy Podcast. We're talking to Gigi Gibbs. Okay, so you went from not wanting to get married, not having kids, to being married and being pregnant. Was with the PCOS, did it in fact turn out to be difficult to get pregnant?
I was not at all. I got pregnant in the 3rd month of trying, and
which is average.
Yeah,
very typical.
Which is great. I didn't have to have any interventions. My endocrinologist said it was really just attributed to my lifestyle and just being able to mitigate those factors with diet and exercise, really.
How was your pregnancy, your first pregnancy?
Overall, it was a really good pregnancy. I had pretty classical pregnancy symptoms, this heightened sense of smell, food cravings for things that I hadn't eaten in a long time, food aversions. Chicken really grossed me out.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes. The sight of it, just, ooh. And before I even knew I was pregnant, my husband and I were on vacation, and I was just like, we're at a restaurant, and I was like, I want a steak. And mind you, I didn't even buy beef, didn't bring it in the house, wasn't even a part of my diet. I was vegan for a long time before. Wasn't vegan at the time, but it wasn't something that was a part of my life. And again, before I knew I was pregnant, I'd eaten like 4 dozen eggs in less than 12 days. I was craving. That's all I wanted to eat during my pregnancy was like eggs.
Do you feel, in retrospect, do you feel like your body was demanding certain nutrients for the pregnancy?
Oh, totally. Well, I knew after I got into care, I found out that I had low iron. Oh. So that explained why I was wanting beef the whole time.
Especially if you couldn't have chicken.
Yes. And I had some of the typical fatigue and a little bit of nausea, not a whole lot, but overall, it was a good pregnancy. But
when did you start thinking about birth and birth options or a vision for how you wanted to give birth?
I knew I'm a pretty crunchy woman just in general. And so I knew I've always been in a place of prevention and using alternative health as a way of just daily living. So I knew early on I wanted to work with a midwife and have a home birth. So that was something already in my brain.
Was your husband on board with that plan too?
No.
Oh.
At the time, we were living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Santa Monica, so everybody was really close to each other. And so his concern was, he didn't want the noise and just want our privacy invaded and didn't want to be intruding upon our neighbors. So it was
more about the comfort of the environment than the medical concerns?
Well, until I took him to a birth center, that's what I thought it was.
Uh-huh.
And so I took him to a birth center, and he was just like, well, where's all the equipment? I was like, that's not how it works. That's the whole point.
Right. I mean, a birth center is essentially giving birth in somebody else's apartment.
Exactly. And so we ended up coming to a compromise. And the compromise was we would do a hospital birth with all the equipment that he felt more comfortable with a midwife. And so that was the plan for the first birth.
Was that comfortable for you?
The plan as I was pregnant was, it went fine. But then once it came down time to have the baby, it was not comfortable at all.
How did your labor start?
I didn't start. I was due on a Thursday, and so I didn't have the baby. And so the following Monday, I went in for just a regular check, and my midwife said she wanted me to have an ultrasound to check my fluids. And the doctor said, "Oh, your fluids are low. You need to go to the hospital right now and have this baby."
There
And
was even a doctor in the ultrasound practice, or a doctor who did your ultrasound and in
there
your
was
midwifery?
yes, she was a midwifery in a private practice, so it wasn't the UCLA midwives.
Okay.
She was in a private practice.
Okay, so there were doctors in that practice too.
Correct.
And
Yes.
they were concerned about the low fluid. And now you're
Hmm.
just a few days past your due date. Is that right?
Correct. I was 4 days past.
Okay. Did you go to the
And
hospital?
no, they wanted me to go straight to the hospital. I walked home. I called my doula. I was really upset. I was crying. Like, no, I don't
Oh,
want to. I wasn't having any signs of showing anything that I was at all ready. I wasn't even having Braxton Hicks or anything like that. And so she told me just to drink a lot of fluids, and she told me how subjective those tests are and just to wait it out as long as I could. And I got a phone call from the hospital, and my husband was already at the hospital. They had called him and told him to
oh
come.
wow.
Yes, totally jumping the gun without even, yeah.
Wow.
So I got myself to the hospital, and I agreed to have another fluid check, ultrasound. And it was like borderline, and I was okay, like going home and not dealing with them. And my husband, who is much more, I should say, much less risk averse than me, he wasn't comfortable with that idea. And again, we compromised. So I agreed to stay in the hospital for just monitoring. But as you know, and as you've talked about many times on your podcast, once you get checked in, all those magical things start to happen.
Yeah. How did it play out for you?
Oh, it played out just like the movie, The Business of Being Born.
Uh,
It literally did. It was just one intervention after the other. You
so
know,
they wanted to induce you?
oh, they did the Cervidil, they induced me, stripped my membranes. I mean, after that time in the hospital, I had more things in my vagina than I care to remember.
Right.
It was just, what was the thing they stick inside you to help you dilate. I mean, it was literally just like the movie. And then they induced me, and then, oh, it's still not going fast enough. You're on the clock type feeling. They tried to they did Pitocin on me, and they couldn't really turn up the Pitocin because as soon as I would have a contraction, they would see that my son's heart rate was having decelerations.
Oh, D cells.
Yes. So, and I never even felt any of these contractions. I mean, you have to understand the only thing that I was having labor wise was just vomiting and diarrhea. I wasn't feeling any contractions.
So
I
you had
wasn't,
no pain meds at this point?
no, there was no pain other than I had this sharp pain. If I tried to sit down or lie down, I would just get this sharp shooting pain, but no like labor pains.
But no medication for pain. So no epidural.
No epidural. Didn't get an epidural. Thank
Okay.
goodness.
And you
No.
weren't really feeling labor despite all their efforts to get things going.
Right, because one, I couldn't lay down. They couldn't turn up the Pitocin. I mean, I didn't even know I was having a contraction unless the monitor was telling me.
Yeah.
So basically, by the third day, it was just a lot of dehydration and vomiting and diarrhea. That's all it was for like 2.5 days. And then finally, they told me that, just like in the movie, oh, we need to do what's best for the baby. And so told me they recommended doing a C-section and that I needed to have one. And they were calling it an emergency C-section. And I'm looking back at all this with hindsight to realize that if it was an emergency, we wouldn't have waited for my husband to come back from lunch.
Oh, wow. Well, there's only two types of C-section nomenclature-wise. There's scheduled cesarean and emergency cesarean, but there should be a third one called non-scheduled, non-emergency C-section, which it sounds like what you had.
That's a really great classification.
So, how was that experience for you?
Oh, it was totally against everything I wanted in terms of how I envisioned birth going. I was a hypno mom, so I had all of the hypno babies training under my belt, expecting to be able to use all of that. I mean, I don't even have ibuprofen in my house. So the idea to go to that extreme of an intervention was just really against how I live and what I had envisioned for the birth. And just the outcomes that I'd read about, I didn't want my son to miss out on just the, all of the vaginal seeding that was going on in my body and getting all of that, those healthy bacteria. I didn't want my body to have to go through that kind of recovery and surgery. So I was not happy about it.
Sorry. Did it go well? I mean, mechanically?
Mechanically, it went well. There was, I went in at 12 o'clock and my son was out by 12:19. My husband was there. They got him out, took him off somewhere. I just remember screaming, "Where's my baby? Where's my baby?" And it just seemed like such a long time to be able to see and hold my baby. And they had to take him off to the side somewhere apparently and get him to respond. But as soon as he responded, his APGAR scores were like 9s, and he was fine.
He was healthy.
Yes, he was healthy. He was fine. They'd said his cord was around his neck, and his head was, quote, stuck. They had like this little indentation on the side of his head. It was stuck against my sacrum. So
how was your recovery?
Physically, it was fine. I didn't really have any issues physically, but the bigger struggle was the mental and emotional, just from the sadness of the type of birth that I'd had. It just a sense of disappointment, I guess. And yeah, that took a while. And I guess it was disappointing because somewhere inside, I just felt this wasn't necessary. It shouldn't have gone down like this. Like, I didn't see a true medical need for all of those things to have happened. So that's why there was that lingering sense of sadness and disappointment.
That's understandable. How have you worked to process through that?
Oh, journaling, some therapy, and then even during my second pregnancy, some things came up that I didn't even realize were there. And so I processed it then. And part of it was, okay, when I got pregnant the second time, was really harnessing my power. And
well, let's jump into that. But before we do that, let's take a break and then talk about your most recent pregnancy and birth experience.
Okay.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Informed Pregnancy Podcast. We are talking to Gigi Gibbs. Okay, so the great news is the positive outcome from your first pregnancy, that you and the baby are both healthy. You recovered well physically, but it left you a little bit emotionally scarred, it sounds like, which is very, very common. It's something that I see almost every day in the practice. And then you start to talk about taking that experience into your second pregnancy and harnessing the power that it gave you. Can you talk more about that?
Yes, I approached my second pregnancy with a lot more determination and less of a willingness to compromise on the things that were important to me. And chief among that was how I was going to have my child.
So now you have a record going to this pregnancy as already having had a cesarean birth.
Yes.
So this one would be a trial of labor after cesarean or vaginal birth after cesarean. So you had one more hurdle to overcome. What kind of support did you look for this time?
That's a good question. Well, luckily, I have a really good group of fellow crunchy mom friends and girlfriends. And so I had awesome support in that area. My husband, on the other hand, he was not on board with this idea. He was totally against it because of the previous cesarean factor.
So against the idea of doing a vaginal birth at all, or doing a vaginal birth outside the hospital?
outside of the hospital. I'm sorry, I
Okay.
should have stated that I did not want to go back to a hospital, and I was still wanting to have a midwifery model of care, and I wanted to have a home birth. And that's just because I knew my body was capable of this, and I wanted to give my body the best opportunity without the potential for interventions. And he just was not comfortable at all with the even 1 out of 1,000 potential risk of uterine rupture.
Wow. So how do you come to some kind of place where you both feel comfortable? You sound very uncomfortable going back to the hospital. He sounds very uncomfortable not being in the hospital. Ideally, you end up on the same page. I mean, unfortunately, it doesn't always happen.
You're right, and it didn't happen that way at all, really. I really forged ahead with my plan. I interviewed midwives, and I had an idea early on who I was going to work with, just from A, listening to your show, and B, my other mom friends who had worked with midwives and had successful home births. So I interviewed midwives, and when I had narrowed down who I wanted to work with, I had the three of us meet, the midwife, my husband, and he came into it still very resistant and against the idea of having a home birth. And we met with one particular midwife who really, she was wonderful in many ways. One, she taught me a lot about my body and how my history of athleticism and sports and how I'd been taught to hold my body as a gymnast and a dancer kind of inhibited the natural progression of birth.
Hmm.
And
I think a lot
that
of people
was,
don't realize that.
I never did. She spent all of like maybe 5 minutes just looking at my birth records. And then she just asked me, didn't know anything about me, and just said, "What kind of sports did you do growing up?"
Yeah.
And it was pretty, and she just taught me about how, when you're a gymnast and a dancer, you're taught to hold your body up and gird everything and hold it all in, which is just the opposite of what you need for giving birth,
To
which is
open and relax and surrender.
yes, and let go and to soften.
Yeah.
So that day I just stopped going to the gym immediately.
Oh, wow.
And well, because I mean, think about it. When you may not have experienced this, but a woman, as soon as you're pregnant, you're told you need to get ready for the marathon of birth, and it's a workout in of itself, and you need to be prepared. So, hey, I was game.
Oh, so you really took it in stride. I mean, there's two parts to that. There's the strength and the endurance, but then there's also the flexibility and the openness and also the mind component, being able to slow things down and relax.
Yes. Well, I did the physical component to the nth degree for sure.
How far along in your pregnancy were you when you picked a midwife?
Well, that's kind of a tricky answer. Let's just say there were like 6 midwives before I had my midwife.
Oh, really? You went through a lot.
Well, so I had this meeting with this midwife and my husband, and she was a real paradigm shifter. She told my husband, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be home birth or nothing. And she said we had options and we can approach it with an ABC mentality. Plan A being we labor at home, and if everything goes well, we continue on and have the baby at home. Plan B being we could labor at home, and then if we notice there's a shift or something could be threatening mom or baby, then we go to the hospital and we can continue birth there. Or plan B, for example, if we had an ultrasound at 37 weeks and saw that there could be a potential risk factor, then we could just jump to plan B and have a VBAC at the hospital. And so she presented all of these options, with plan C being we could have a trial of labor at home and then ultimately we end up at the hospital, or we have a planned C-section if we see something. And she introduced this idea of working in tandem with an OB, and that way she, as the midwife, could have a lot more information about what's going on with my body, what's going on with the baby, and we could make informed decisions along the way, especially as we get down to the final month of pregnancy. And my husband was really open to that. After hearing that it wasn't going to be this extremist all or nothing home birth or die approach, he was on board. And
Well, that's refreshing.
yes.
I mean, it must give you some sense of calm.
Oh, I was like grinning ear to ear when we left that meeting. And the other thing she told us to do, so she was helpful in that she taught me about my body, informed me about my birth, and then she got my husband on board. And then the third thing she did was she introduced me to this awesome OB, because she told me, as a Black woman, she said, we talked openly about the maternal mortality statistics and risks for Black women. And so she introduced me to this African-American OB. Her name's Dr. Aflac. I don't know what I was saying there.
I'm hoping to meet up with her soon and maybe even interview her. She sounds amazing. I haven't been able to connect with her yet.
Yeah. So the midwife told me, go meet with this doctor, tell her what you want and the things that you don't want to be discriminated against for your age, all of the past cesarean, all of these things. Because I was 40 at the time that I got pregnant, and then 41 by the time I was going to give birth.
The second time.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel like those things played a role in your first birth experience?
I wouldn't say
your age or your race.
Definitely not my age, because I got pregnant with no problems and I didn't have any end of pregnancy complications regarding my health. So certainly nothing to my age. Race, I don't think so. I mean, I didn't, for one, I was in a whole other space while I was going through the labor, but I don't personally think that it played into it. But
for you, I mean, it clearly does for a lot of women. I mean, the numbers are, astronomical in terms of the outcomes for Black women and babies compared to white women and babies. And we did a whole episode on that. But it's good to know that you didn't feel that was a part of the treatment that you got.
No, I didn't feel it was a part of it, but I wasn't going to dismiss it as not being a risk factor for the second time. So it was still definitely on my radar. And in fact, as soon as I knew I was pregnant, I went into care with an African-American OB, just knowing that African-American women have, 4 to 5 times more likely than white women to have a pregnancy-related death. So while I was looking for my midwife, I was fully aware of that and wasn't going to go into the second pregnancy blind of that and just try to mitigate any potential for that.
Sure. So it sounds like you found really great support in terms of your midwife and your backup OB and their willingness to work together.
Yes. And once I met with the OB and then called my insurance, and my insurance was going to pay for the midwife. So everything, my husband even said, great, call the midwife and let's go. And so I'm reaching out to the midwife and she never got back to me.
Oh, no.
No, 2.5 weeks went by and I hadn't heard back from her. No voicemails, no texts, no email, nothing. And I was just like, oh, great. So I had to start all over again.
Oh, my goodness.
And yes. And so here I am, where we drove across town to go meet another midwife. We go downtown and we're in the middle of this meeting. And she's asking, what do you want for your birth? And so I told her about this ABC approach. And right in the middle of the interview, my husband just says, oh, well, I'm not on board for that. And I stop and I'm just like, on board for what? And he says, I'm not on board for the home birth.
Oh, I thought he was before.
And let me tell you, I just look at him, I was like, what are we here for? And it was so, I don't know what happened in his brain. I don't know if something triggered in him, because it was at least a 30-minute drive. I mean, this is pre-COVID, so there was LA traffic to where we were going. And we had discussion the whole way about questions we were going to ask. And he had even asked the woman about payment policy of if we have the birth at home versus if we have it home and then have to transfer to the hospital. He was asking questions that showed he knew what we were there for. So then to just in the middle of this meeting to say, oh, I'm not on board for that, totally threw me and this midwife off.
Just threw me off.
Yes. And he just was adamant that, I was never on board for a home birth. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I even showed him the text message where he was just like, great, call the midwife. Let's do this.
That's so stressful on so many levels.
Oh my goodness, yes.
I mean, you must have got them back on board somehow.
Um,
Ish.
well, I tried. I continued to meet with midwives, and I had to go into the meeting now with this new preface of, oh, and by the way, my husband is really on the fence with this, and asking the midwife to perhaps you as the medical expert can put him at ease and answer his concerns. And so subsequent meetings, the next midwife we partnered with, she was totally on board to take on that task of working with my spouse who was nervous about the health risks of doing a VBAC at home. And she really turned into almost like marriage counselor slash mediator. Because at this point, the marriage was extremely stressed. My husband was not at all supportive during my pregnancy. And yeah, so we were with this other midwife. This is like now the third one. And I thought things were in a good place. And then he emailed her in the middle of the night and without even telling me, and just told him he wasn't on board. He wasn't on board with the home birth, to which she responded, well, I'm not going to work with a couple who doesn't have both partners
Oh, no.
on the same page. And so at this point, we are now into COVID having happened. And I had to scramble again to find another midwife. And I reached out to midwives that I had interviewed early on, and they were, one in particular she was full. And so COVID is in place, and I found a midwife, woohoo, and paid my deposit, all of that, we get going. And then she tells me that one of the midwives that she's in partnership with got COVID, and so she was taking on her cases, and she gave me my money back, and so I had to find another midwife.
What a roller coaster. Wow.
Yes. And during all this, I'm like doing this covertly. At this point, I'm seeing Dr. Aflac as my primary caregiver. I'm doing this covertly without my husband's involvement, because at this point, we were just really at odds relationally.
Oh, so stressful.
And luckily, I had interviewed enough midwives prior to, like, when I first got pregnant. I reached out to my last and final midwife, because a lot of midwives were either going one of two routes. They were inundated because of COVID happening, and they were inundated with people jumping ship and not wanting to go birth in hospitals, or they were being extremely particular because there were so many people coming to them with the reaction to COVID. And so these last group of midwives I reached out to, they knew I was home birth determined and had that makeup prior to COVID. So they took me on.
Well, and a lot of people did switch to home birth because of COVID in this area. We're over our time, but I really want to get into your birth story and see how this played out. So let's take an extra break. When we come back, find out how things finally went down. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Informed Pregnancy Podcast for a bonus segment. Wow, a lot of twists and turns that even though I had seen you, I didn't really know some of that was going on. What happened in the end? So you were down to your last midwife.
I'm down to my last midwife, and my midwives weren't even attuned to the fact that my husband wasn't on board. I just was like, okay, I'm going to have to deal with that when I get there. I mean, I went into care with these midwives when I was like 34 weeks pregnant. So it was that far down the train.
Wow.
And in my last month of pregnancy, I just had this sit down with my husband and just said, look, and I tried to come from a place of compassion and love, and acknowledged his fears and the needs that he needed to have met, which were his ultimate thing about safety and his fear of a uterine rupture. And I sat him down and I talked with him, and I told him, I understand that, and here are my concerns and here are my needs, and I need to be in a place where I can feel mentally safe and not on guard and so forth. And because I'm the one that ultimately has to push this baby out, I need to give a little bit more consideration to what my needs are. And I tried my hardest, Dr. Berlin, to not pull that card of, it's my body, so I'm going to make the decision. I tried to make it as compassion filled as possible, but that still didn't resonate with him. And he was still not on board, and yes, just went to some unpleasant places.
I'm so
And
sorry.
so I found a doula, and I told my midwives it was just going to be like old school birthing where it was just the women and the men were just not going to be there. And I told my midwife, because I had a 3-year-old, that my husband was just going to be off taking care of our son, because we also have to remember this is COVID, so we couldn't
Bring
just
extra people in.
couldn't bring a babysitter, couldn't go send my son to grandma's house. So he's going to be off providing childcare, and it's just going to be midwives, doulas, and mom. And I even told my husband, I told him I didn't want him to be at the birth. A part of it was just the energy of his fear. I couldn't have that in this space. And I didn't want to have to be on for him, if you know what I mean. Meaning if I'm going through labor, I didn't want to have to feel like I needed to shrink myself or downplay what I was feeling and experiencing, because I didn't want to make him go to a place of fear. And I just wanted to be able to be fully in my body without having to worry about his worry. And then I just didn't want the energy of fear in the space. So I just told him I didn't want him to be, he could be at the house. By this time we had moved, by the way, weren't in a single family home. And I told him he could be at the house, and that was fine, but I just didn't want him in the room. And he was still very defensive at this point and was just like, well, I'm just going to leave anyways. I'm just going to take our son and I'm just going to leave, and you can just call me after the baby's born. That was kind of his defensive response. And yeah,
It's really, I mean, so much stress internally and externally. I can't imagine what kind of pressure under, especially going into, a birth where you're trying to have a very different experience, where you're trying to really surrender, let go, relax, open up.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like just so many things were stacked against you. How did your labor start the second time?
It started, well, it's interesting. I was due on June 1st. So that was a Monday. And so the Sunday prior, so what day is that? May 31st, I started having contractions. And I have to understand, at the time, I didn't know what contractions felt like because I'd never felt them in my first pregnancy.
Never had them, right.
And so I at least have, in telling this, I have hindsight to help me. But it was literally just like Cinderella meets a vampire, because it would be like 12 o'clock at night and I'd start getting these sensations, these contractions. And I'd already been having some Braxton Hicks, so I'd gotten to experience those. And it's like, oh, this is different. Okay. And then as soon as the sun would come up, 5 a.m., the contractions would stop.
Oh, wow.
And that just proceeded on. I went past my due date, and it was fast forward to Friday, and the contractions didn't wait until midnight to start. It started about dinner time. And by then I'd had like 5 or 6 days of this. So I was like, okay, here we go.
Just another day. Was it exhausting? It must be exhausting.
It wasn't exhausting because there was so much anticipation and excitement, because I was like, oh, okay, is this, I thought for sure the baby was going to come on Wednesday. You got to remember, and there was also like the full moon going on at that time. So at that point I was just like, okay, when is it going to happen? So yeah, it was just the anticipation of, okay, is this it? Is this going to be it? And so Friday we go into the night, and then at about 1:30 in the morning, I was, just going through my stages. I was just doing my breathing, listening to my Hypnobabies tracks. And at about 1:30 in the morning, my husband comes in the room. And just so you know, he'd already been sleeping on the couch because I was sleeping with like 8 pillows in the bed. And he came in to check on me because he was just like, he's like, you were really loud that last time. Are you okay? And that was the first time he'd like come to check on me during this whole week. And so I was like, yeah, it's not going away, and it's a little more intense. And he asked me, said, should we, do you want to call somebody? And so I agreed. I waited about an hour, and then I called my doula. It was that feeling of not wanting to bug somebody.
Oh, wow. But that's what we're here for.
Right. But you don't know, like, okay, is this going to be a false alarm or is this the real thing? And so I'd been timing them. And so I saw that they were about 10 minutes apart. And so I called my doula and she said to get in the water and to, maybe take a shower or a bath. And that was awesome. That immediately
Oh, felt good to be in water?
Oh, yes. Oh, my goodness, yes.
Did you do a shower or bath?
I did a bath. I got in a bathtub, and that just, the contractions still kept coming, but it just made them more bearable. Yeah. And one thing I should say at this point, back on Mother's Day, which was May 10th, it was about 3 weeks before I was due, there was a shift with my husband, and he never told me directly, but I overheard him talking to his mom about the birth, and I overheard him saying, almost like defending the decision to have a home birth. And I heard him telling his mom, yeah, she's going to have a doula, and she's got 2 midwives, and she's got an OB, so we're going to be fine. And yeah, we're just going to go forward with the home birth. And I was in the bathroom, and I overheard him having this conversation. It was just like, oh, yay.
Just in the nick of time.
The last 3 weeks, yeah, he was still adamant that he wasn't in support, but that he was going to be supportive, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does.
So his plan was, I'll be here to move the couches, to set up the pool, but when the midwives get here, I'm going to leave. So that was still his position. So I'm in the water, and I call my doula after about 3 hours in the water. And at this point, it was about 5:30 in the morning, and the sun had come up. 5 o'clock came, and the contractions didn't stop, and they were still intensifying. So no more vampire going back into the coffin. And I made the decision. I told her to be here by 7 a.m. because by that point, my 3-year-old son was going to wake up, and my husband was going to have to go take care of him. And she arrived right on time at 7 o'clock, and I got out of the water. We did some labor in my birth room. And then after about 2 hours, we got back in the water. That felt amazing again. This time it was in the shower.
Okay.
And then I converted that to just the bathtub. And I was listening to my Hypnobabies tracks and really just in my own space, in my mind. At one point, and this was where things really shifted, my son came in to just say hi and check on me. And I'm still breastfeeding him. And so he popped on the boob. And oh my goodness, Dr. Berlin, that just, that shifted the labor from there.
A year?
That was, yes,
Oxytocin?
Things really took off. And it wasn't even long. He literally just suckled for maybe 45 seconds, 60 seconds. And I was like, okay, get off me. And the contractions really escalated from there. And I got back in the water, and my doula says, she saw that the contractions were like 5 to 6 minutes apart. She decided to call my midwife. And my midwife, she asked me, she said, do you want me to just come check you? And the way she asked was awesome because it made me feel like, oh, I'm not going to be one of these false alarms. Because they had told me, they said, since you haven't given birth before, it can take up to 2 days. So I was prepared, like, okay, this baby's not coming until Monday. And so I was like, okay, yeah, just come check me. So that was the plan. She was going to come check me. This was about 12 o'clock or so on Saturday. And then things intensified. And I got to this point of like, where is my midwife? Where is
You're
Leslie
ready.
at? Yes. So she gets there, and I can tell you in hindsight, she was stopped up because of all of the demonstrations going on and everything that was happening with the Floyd protest and, as a result of the whole murder. So she finally gets there, and I'm just like, okay, just tell me. I just need to hear just 4 centimeters. Just give me 4 centimeters. My doula thought she was going to say 6 to 7, and I just need to know how much longer. And so my midwife, she puts on this glove, and she's like, don't even get out of the water. She's like, you're fine. Just stay right there. And she checks me, and she says, oh, you're fully effaced, and there's no cervix. You're dilated.
Oh, my. Wow.
Right? And I said to her, I was like, are you sure? And one thing about my midwife, she's one of these OG midwives, and she's a real straight shooter. And she just looks down to me over the rim of her glasses, and she just says, after doing this for over 44 years, I think I'm sure. You're ready to push.
Wow. That must be so exhilarating. I feel exhilarated.
I was not ready to hear that. I mean, I know that's what you want to hear, but I was just like, what? So yeah, what I had been going through was like the whole transition. That's when I was like literally crawling up the shower wall.
Oh.
And so she told me, she said, okay, you're going to need to go to the bathroom, because I hadn't gone pee, and I certainly hadn't done a number 2 in like 2 days. So they got me out of the water and told me to just sit on the toilet and try to pass everything there. And I'll never forget that moment, because one, I was out of the water, so I was no longer mitigating the effects of gravity on my body, and I could feel every contraction. And then my stomach had this weird shape. It was like everything had been sucked out except the baby. So it wasn't this round orb I was looking at. It was just this weird cube looking shape. And I was just looking at my stomach like, how is that going to come out of me? How is that going to happen? And so I told them I wanted to lay down, because it was just too painful to be upright. And I went and laid down, and I kept asking them, are you sure? And what am I supposed to be doing? Because from all the stories I'd heard on your show and other women, my water hadn't broken. I wasn't feeling, quote, pushy. I wasn't making any of those noises that women make or grunting that I was expecting to hear. There was no physical cue telling me, oh, it's time to push this baby out. And finally, my midwife just leveled with me again and just said, look, Gigi, she said, the only thing standing in the way of that baby coming out is you. You just need to push it out. And she said, it can take 2, sometimes 3 hours, because if you've never done this before, she said, I've got all day, so don't feel rushed. Just know that you just got to push. So with that, I just knew, okay, this isn't going to be some physiological cue that's going to just take over my body. And I just had to go inside of a place mentally. In fact, I went to my pelvic floor doctor's office. I learned about on your show, yay, woohoo, because she had me doing these practice pushes. And so I just closed my eyes. I just used my mental visual game and just pictured myself on her table doing those practice pushes. And I pushed, and the first time the baby's head came out.
Oh, wow.
And
with one push?
Yes. Well, I skipped over the part that my bowels got cleared. I wanted to spare your listeners all of that.
Oh,
but yes.
Okay.
So I pushed, and then my bowels got cleared.
Okay.
And so then the real push came. The first real push came. And that was special. And the baby's head came out, but then I went and felt down there, and there was no head. And I'm like, where did it go? Where's the baby's head? And my midwife, she's like, well, I didn't want to tell you that was going to happen. And she starts doing this demonstration about how gravity sucks the head back up.
Oh, it went back in.
Yes. And I'm like, so I have to do that again? And she's like, yes. And she told me that's the way your body prepares. It's like stretching before the exercise, so you don't tear. And I was like, oh my God, I had to get my mind around the fact that I was going to do that again. And so I pushed a second time, and this time the baby's head stayed out, and it was just hanging there.
Oh, wow.
And so they showed me with a mirror, and I'm touching the baby's head, and it was just like, okay, one more push. And my midwife said, just one more good push and get those shoulders out. And that was literally the scream heard around my neighborhood.
Oh, yeah, that's intense.
And the baby came out on the third push, and it was right there. I mean, I caught the baby right there and put it right on my chest with my doula. And I was just like, what is it? What is it? Because I didn't know the sex. That was another thing I decided I wanted to wait. And they're like, they wouldn't tell me. They said, look. And I'm looking down, and I'm, there was so much skin, and there's the cord and everything. And there wasn't anything there. And I said, is it a girl? It's a girl. And they were like, yes, it's a girl. And I was like, I knew it. And, that was, of course, after the initial, like, I did it. That was my first reaction. I was like, I did it. I did it.
Oh.
And yeah, it was less than 30 minutes of pushing.
Was your husband with you in the end?
Yeah. So before I started pushing, they had started to say, go get her husband, go get her husband. And my doula started to leave. And I said, don't you leave. No. Like she had been, I was holding her hand with one hand, and I was having prodromal back labor. And so she was like girding my back with her other hand. And I was like, don't you leave. And so they sent the midwife's assistant to go get him and my son. And he declined going in. He said, I don't want to be there for that. Just come get me when it's out. And he said he didn't want our son to see that. But I already told him I was okay with our son being there and him being there. But he's a little more squeamish, so he didn't want to be in there for the pushing. So as soon as the baby was out, they went and got my husband and my son. And it was a totally different experience. My daughter was literally just went from being inside me to on my chest, no running to the other side of the room, no screaming for where's my baby. I was just in shock, literally like, oh my God, I did it.
It's so amazing and beautiful. Like you did everything really on your own this time. By the time your midwives got there, most of the work was done.
And I was not expecting that at all.
It's a beautiful story. And I don't know, does it help with your healing from your first experience?
Oh, for sure. For sure. In the sense of knowing that my body was capable of doing something and not being able to exercise that ability, that right. And then the second time around, like really seeing what my body was capable of, having that sense of gratitude, that sense of accomplishment, and then just the sense of awe for our bodies and what they're able to do.
I've been doing this for so long, and that still never gets old.
Right.
For me. It's just amazing every single time.
And marriage-wise, it was healing.
Yeah, I was wondering, we're way out of time now, but I wondered, how did that relationship recover afterwards?
Well, the day of, my husband was, of course, calling everybody and bragging about his wife who had an unmedicated, no pain meds, whatever birth. Mm-hmm. But then after a few days, we talked about the birth and what it was like for each of us. And, the funny thing I forgot to tell you is the baby was born. She was born on our wedding anniversary.
Oh, wow. That seems symbolic.
Yes. And it was just, you got to remember, like, during this pregnancy, I was in a really dark, alone place regarding my marriage, just questioning the future of my marriage, questioning the decision to have another baby. I had to just kind of focus one thing at a time, just have the baby and deal with the marriage stuff later. So I was coming from that kind of a place to, what does this mean that this baby was born on our wedding anniversary date? And then realizing I've got this other life here that I'm sharing with my husband and the responsibilities that come with all of that. And we had a long talk one night and talked about what repair looks like, talked about each of our hurts and how we could mend those. And then since then, we've just been talking about, we come together after the kids are born, we hold hands, we talk about what we're grateful for from the day. We've been praying for each other together and really just been conscious about our communication, which has been our big stumbling block, and repairing a lot faster when we do have disagreements. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like it's headed in a good direction.
It's headed in a good direction for sure. What nobody tells you in becoming a parent is that the hardest part isn't about the sleep deprivation or the child, it's the relationship in your marriage. That's the real challenge.
My wife, who is a perinatal psychologist, it's her whole life work is trying to help people prepare the relationship for what happens once you add new family members to it. Mm-hmm. It's challenging, but it's a difficult challenge because it's hard to imagine you'll have that problem before you have it. And nobody really wants to invest resources, time, or effort or money into a problem they don't have yet. But over and over again, we see that for many people, that's the hardest part of the whole transition.
And that was so true for us after our first child.
Well, I'm very grateful to you. You obviously shared your story so open and honestly. You're a very strong, powerful person. I feel honored to know you and to have been able to work with you. And I know that your story, in many levels, there's so many facets to your story, is going to help other people who listen to it and learn from it. So I'm grateful to you for a lot of things, but for sharing your story here with us on the podcast.
Thank you. And I'm grateful for your platform. It helped me in so many ways. And I'm grateful that so many other women get the information and that's the empowerment that has come from so much of what I've learned.
That's 100% the mission. At home, thanks for listening to the Informed Pregnancy Podcast. If you like our program, please share us with your friends and leave us some feedback in your podcast app. We try to get to all of it, and it's meaningful to us. For more pregnancy and parenting related media, visit informedpregnancy.com.
Doctor, give me the news. I got a whole